I'd like to introduce flint knapping. A person who makes flake stone tools is a flint knapper. Two main methods are used for removing flakes from stone tools. One of these is percussion and the other is pressure flaking. When we talk about percussion, we also talk about the type of hammer. Was it a hard hammer? Was it a soft hammer? Likewise, we talk about how the hammer was applied. Was it applied through direct percussion or through indirect percussion? In percussion, your two hands are separated. You bring the hammer forcefully against the rock you are working. A hammerstone is used for hard hammer percussion. How can an archaeologist tell that they've got a hammerstone? You look for signs of hammering. Here's some very fresh looking signs of hammering on these two rocks. And sometimes you can find finger holds that are polished. I think those are always really interesting to see. For soft hammer percussion, softer materials such as this antler that you see is used. And also you can use bone or you can use very hard woods such as dogwood. In this picture also shows you a flint knapper's partial kit, not only the antler bopper, but a leather glove, a piece of leather, and a braider. Direct percussion is when you directly hit one rock with another rock. Indirect percussion is when you don't hit the rock directly, but instead you hit a bone, antler, or piece of wood that's held against the rock. The object that you hit is called a punch. I bring up bipolar reduction here, even though it's not the same as regular flint knapping. In flint knapping, you can predict the flakes that you will take off. Bipolar reduction is something that you use when you have material that's not suitable for flint knapping because it's round, it's a pebble or a cobble. Flint knapping requires an edge, kind of a 90-degree angle or so. In bipolar reduction, you place the pebble on an anvil and you hit it with a hard hammer. And we'll talk more about bipolar reduction later on. Pressure flaking, you keep constant contact between your fine point that you're pushing and the stone. And it takes a lot of pressure to remove a flake. Here the person very sensibly is holding a thick leather between the tools in his hand to protect his hand. In any movies that you watch of flint knapping, pay attention to which part of the body supplies the force for pressure flaking. As stated previously, what the archaeologist mostly has to work with is debitage. Thankfully, a skilled lithic analyst can somewhat tell from the debitage what sorts of tools were being made. One of the questions that the analysts often ask themselves, or the archaeologists asked, what stage do I see in the reduction process, in the steps that must be taken from the raw material to the finished tool? A number of reduction schemes have been proposed, as you can tell from reading our Andrzejewski textbook. Here, I will very much simplify it and talk about just 3 steps. Given that the material may have outer cortex that's not good for flint knapping, during primary reduction, you will remove the cortex and do the initial working down of the raw material to form a blank. Most likely, you'd do this at the quarry so that you don't have to carry a bunch of extra rock. How could you tell from the flakes whether you are in this primary stage of removal of cortex? Well, the flakes might be quite large and they'll have some cortex on the dorsal surface rather than only flake scars on the dorsal surface. This slide shows you some flakes with cortex on them, and in particular you can see that all of these, the entire surface is covered in cortex. The striking platform here has cortex, and this flake also still has some cortex on it. In secondary reduction, you've removed all the cortex from the flakes and you are now finishing the shape of the tool. And instead of cortex, flakes will have flake scars on the dorsal surface from earlier flakes that were taken off. In tertiary reduction, you finish with fine pressure flaking. And pressure flakes will be a different shape than will flakes from percussion. And some of the pressure flakes may be quite small. But as Andrzejewski points out, many different reduction sequences have been outlined. Here I compress the sequence down to just 3 major steps. Your assignment is to now watch these flint knapping demonstrations, and I suggest that you watch them in the order listed here. If you need to see this slide for longer than you see it during this narrated video, simply reopen it in Blackboard and come back and click on just this slide alone. And if you're interested, you can go ahead and watch Flintknapping a Spearhead Parts 2 and Part 3.